So, Rudy, let's start with the big story this afternoon, the economic fiscal update provided by the government. Your first observation, what'd you think?
So my first observation is that two of the goodies were already announced because, as you know, the Carney government already announced that the GST rebate will be increased and will be mailed, I believe it's June 5th. So that was already announced. The second goodie that was already announced was the gas tax, the fact that they're taking out 10 cents on the liter. But what was very important today that we learned are two things. The first one is that the government is investing heavily in terms of training skilled workers because, as you know, we want to have big projects. We have a housing crisis, and for that, we need labor. So the government is putting a lot of money, $6 billion in terms of programs for apprenticeship and from skilled workers. The only problem, and it's a political problem, is that labor is a provincial jurisdiction, meaning you can look at perhaps a fight between Quebec and Ottawa, because if Ottawa wants to do any strings attached to that money or those programs or just put a stamp of the federal government on it, that can be a problem for the new Premier, Christine Fréchette. So it will be interesting to see what will be the reaction of Quebec in terms of those that money, that program. But you can understand that that's something that the Carney government is tackling because it is true that it's very important. As you know, we cannot have big projects. We cannot solve the housing crisis without having skilled workers. And lastly, but most importantly, the number of the deficit, yes, it is lower. Why? Because inflation is high, because the price of oil is high, meaning the government has more revenues. So that's why the deficit is $11 billion lower. But is there going to be a return? No. For the next 5 years, the Carney government is still looking at around $50 billion deficit for the next 5 years.
So with respect to this skilled labor program that you just talked about, and that's really the big sort of focal point in this particular update, when you talk about Quebec, so this is a matter of they're going to say, here's how much money and here's how we want you to spend it. Is it's always the problem in Quebec? And Quebec will simply want to say, just give us the money and we'll figure out how to spend it.
Exactly. Quebec will say, we already have our programs, we have our union, we have construction commission in Quebec. If you're going to increase the funding or if you're going to make new money available, transfer it to us and we'll make it happen instead of transferring directly to workers, for example. Okay. It's always the problem, and it's a test for Christine Fréchette because don't forget, Christine Fréchette is a newly elected premier. She wants to make a difference between François Legault. She wants to show that, yes, she can get money out of Ottawa. We know there's still money in Ottawa in terms of infrastructure. There's still money now in Ottawa in terms of housing. And now today you can add also perhaps some money that she'll need because otherwise the PQ, the Liberals, and others will say, we don't want any strings attached. We don't want any federal program for labor because it's inside Quebec's jurisdiction.
Okay, so with respect to Christine Fréchette, you just brought her up. She was in Washington yesterday meeting with trade representatives, and I thought did a pretty good job suggesting at one point, I think, that the whole idea of some things in Quebec are basically off the table. They're not going to be discussed, and that would include the alcohol situation, right, where we're banning American liquor, and, of course, our management supply system over dairy, for example. So what did you think?
No, I think she had a very good visit. First of all, it was very smart of her to plan that visit very, very early on. François Legault was not a big traveler. I think he only traveled once to Washington as premier. So I think it was good for Christine Fréchette to show the difference. She also was able to secure a very important meeting with the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, where she was able to just, again, restate Quebec's point of view when it comes to supply management, when it comes also to French language and Quebec culture. This is always something that you need to continue to press in Washington in terms of having a cultural exemption. So I think that it was very good for her. This morning, she announced also that Quebec will have kind of a special emissary in those negotiations to being able to make sure that Quebec interest is defended. So I think that it's good, but the reality is that she had a terrific first week as premier, but now the real work will also start next week because she didn't face the opposition, she didn't face a lot, but Saint-Pierre Plamondon and also the Liberals because the National Assembly was prorogued. Right. Work starts next week, so it will be kind of a different media game because for the moment she's been able to make announcement every day, get some good coverage. She just tweeted this morning that perhaps she'll make also an announcement tomorrow in terms of workers. But starting next week, the work is going to be harder because she needs to put forward her legislative agenda, and she has very, very, very little time to do it.
So with respect, by the way, and I think I said management supply, I meant supply management. When you brought up language, how would language enter into negotiations with the U.S.? Like, what's the take for her? What is she looking for?
Well, for example, the Americans don't like the fact that in Quebec, things need to be labeled in French and in English. They see it as a non-tariff barrier in a way that costs money for American suppliers to translate it. They want it out. So those are the kind of cultural things. Also, don't forget Netflix and all of that. Quebec has put forward a bill saying that they want to make sure that on, for example, new TVs that are going to be sold in Quebec, you have all the Quebec app on it in terms of having French language app on it, and not only, for example, Netflix and Amazon. So all of those are things that normally you bring up in those trade negotiations.
Oh, I see. Okay, I hadn't even considered that. So the idea being that the U.S. would want those things waived, and she's saying, no, I'm sorry, that's not even up for discussion.
Exactly.
Okay.
One thing that is interesting also, I forgot to mention about the budget, is that Quebec has announced support for the media in the latest budget.
Yeah.
They ask Ottawa also to do the same. We kind of have a non-answer today because, yes, in the fiscal update, it says that they're going to have a consultation on it, but there's no funding, there's no money attached to any new program when it comes to broadcast support for journalism.
Not provincially, but there is federally, I think, right?
No, that's the opposite. There's provincially now, and there's not federally, which was the Quebec government asking.
Right.
Christine Fréchette and Mathieu Lacombe was asking François-Philippe Champagne for a dedicated program. So for the moment, it's still
I thought I had heard today that they had said that they would provide money for media in general, local broadcast media, but we'll double check. We're going to have Amanda
no
Lang
money.
on, so.
I mean, they said they would, but you don't see money attached to it. There's no number in the budget, in the fiscal update.
Last thing I want to talk about, and I mentioned this off the top, the big announcement yesterday of a sovereign wealth fund. I had someone on who had written 3 years ago in a Globe and Mail editorial that it was time for Canada to have a sovereign wealth fund then. Well, we're finally getting one now. Are you not on board with this?
No, I'm not on board with it because normally you have a wealth fund when you have surpluses and not when you're in deficit. It's kind of basically creating a fund out of debt. So if you're switching one debt because whatever money, the $25 billion that are going to put in that new fund that was announced today is already part of the deficit. So if you look at Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all those countries, even Norway, they started when we had a surplus, took that money and say, okay, we need to diversify. So I don't see it as a real sovereign fund, wealth fund as normally. It's just basically we already have the infrastructure bank that was, for example, announced under the Trudeau government. They're the one who funded the REM in Montreal. Even the new pipeline that was announced a few years ago, the Trans Mountain, was financed out of Export Development Canada. So I'm just asking myself, why have we created the infrastructure bank? Why are we giving more powers to Export Development Canada to create another fund with kind of the same mandate? Who's going to manage it? Which project are they going to finance? There's a lot of question mark in terms of it because at the end of the day, you cannot say, oh, here's some money. You can decide whatever you want, but you have to invest in, for example, projects that we already approved. This is not the definition normally of a return on investment. You pick what is the good project you want, if it's in Canada or abroad.
Rudy, why so negative on the sovereign wealth fund?
I don't know. Not that, no, because for the reality, think about the Caisse de Dépôt. All the time, the Caisse de Dépôt, we always say, oh, the Caisse of Dépôt is not doing as good as they should. Why? Because they have a double mandate. They have to have a good return on investment for Quebecers, but also they have to do economic development. And they always say, oh, it's because we have to invest in Quebec in certain things. That's why we don't have the kind of same return. So I'm just asking myself, if we're going to make that fund, which is normally to maximize our return, but you're having strings attached, that's why there's a difficulty of it. And I just see it as a kind of creative accounting, switching one debt to another debt and financing projects that at the end of the day, the federal government was already going to finance.
Okay. Fair enough. Rudy, I thank you. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Take care.
Aaron.
I'm Luke Wilson. Join me each week for Film Never Lies. Since retiring from the NFL, I've had a lot on my mind, and now I've got my own show. So if you're tired of lazy takes, if you want honest conversations, join us each week. Film Never Lies, available on all TSN platforms and the iHeartRadio app.